are fair and balanced, yet progressive to the needs of our environment and our economic prosperity. I'm your host, Sarah Perium, and I welcome you to this week's Opinion Maker Show, where we want to have a fair and balanced discussion around a hot topic in farming circles. It is around whether we embrace the term regenerative agriculture, or if we believe that we are already regenerative, how do we tell that story when it is a complex scientific understanding of it, and how do we farm better for the future collectively, regardless of a term? Now, my partner and I, we watched the Netflix documentary Kiss the Ground. I highly recommend actually watching it. It's narrated by actor Woody Harrelson and features regenerative agricultural prophet Alan Savory. Through both his lens as an agronomist and myself as an agricultural broadcaster, it actually left me feeling good about promoting the New Zealand way of farming, and that there is many things that is around the understanding of regenerative that, yes, we are already doing in a global context, yet I still believe there is some big conversations that we need to have, and that saying we are already regenerative here in New Zealand maybe not the lifeline to getting a premium just yet. We have a wonderful lineup of guests on the show, and farming commentators such as Wyn-Harris, who will join us shortly, claim that most of the goals and methods of conventional farming, as he does, are already along these lines by our New Zealand sheep and beef farmers. However, the Primary Sector Council has acknowledged that there is a need for more regenerative production systems to reduce our impact on our environment. Where does this leave us when the term is all through Vogue, it's all over Netflix, yet we feel a little bit threatened and hard done by in different corners of our sector? Can we have a mature conversation from all aspects and realise we're all on the same path already? That's what I hope to do throughout the next hour or so here on this week's Opinion Maker. Comments from Facebook over the weekend from our audience have reflected that there is a divide, but the opportunities appear to be more advantageous with this constructive conversation, and that there is more holistic going on than just isolating out certain practices and fundamentally recognising the benefits of soil health. That's what's underpinning this all together, as well as the health of our fresh water and our communities. Now, we're going to have a full breakdown of opinions from across the nation, including on-farm, marketing perspectives, and cultural and science that I've pulled together in our lineup of our show. So, who do we have on this week's Opinion Maker? Regenerative farmer at Lake Hawea Station, but previously the founder of an international vodka brand, 42 Below Vodka, formerly of Saatchi & Saatchi, currently executive chair of Maury Brewing Company, and his philanthropic role at Pure Advantage. Geoff Ross will share his experience behind and beyond the farm gate, not only with the regeneration projects at the station, but also too around how to capture consumer trends. On today's panel, two well-respected science and industry leaders with their views on the direction of New Zealand in this conversation around regen. Okuora and Leaft Foods Director Maury Penno will bring her academic science and industry experience to the conversation, as well as her current role on the steering committee that has come out of the Primary Sector Council vision. And the committee is called Te Taiao, offering a holistic perspective to this practices in New Zealand. She has been previously director of Spark New Zealand and is on the Lincoln University Transformation Board, not only as well as a senior executive at Fonterra. So Maury brings a very wide line of experience to the conversation. And also on the panel, Lincoln University Professor and Vice President of the New Zealand Institute of Agricultural and Horticultural Science, John Hickford, will join Maury and myself to discuss this from all angles, because John says that we need to make a call for proposals on projects to investigate regenerative farming, and it can't happen soon enough. Are the science community feeling threatened by the term? The organisation's published a series of articles from scientists with different disciplines, and this month's online Ag Science magazine, which shows regenerative agriculture quotations is more hype than reality. Please, to kick us off, we will be joined by Hawke's Bay sheep and beef farmer and rural commentator Steve Wyn-Harris, who believes that the organisation he supports with his levies, Beef and Lamb New Zealand, are going down an expensive road to study regenerative agricultural practices that is unbacked by science, and the Primary Sector Council are love-struck with this word, and they're simply preying on the vulnerable, idealistic and foolish. Steve Wyn-Harris kicks us off following his recent Farmers Weekly opinion piece. We have everything for you in this week's Opinion Maker.
This is Sarah's Country, produced in alliance with Farmers Weekly, the place New Zealand farmers turn to for a trusted source of in-depth agricultural journalism. Stay connected to the matters that matter most by subscribing to My Daily Digest at farmersweekly.co.nz.
From his ridge in central Hawke's Bay, farmer and rural commentator Steve Wyn-Harris believes the millions of dollars of government, industry and philanthropic funding supporting a transition of New Zealand farmers to regenerative practices is like teaching granny to suck eggs. And Steve joins us now. Steve, thank you so much for coming on this special edition of Sarah's Country's Opinion Maker, because I value your viewpoint, and it's one that I hear from a lot of farmers in New Zealand. And that is the goals and methods of regenerative agriculture are being done, you say, on your farm already. Can you please explain your sort of guiding principles to how you farm for the benefit of soil health, freshwater health, and to meet our climate goals?
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. There's a bit of frustration amongst those of us who I guess you would term conventional farmers. The talk of regenerative farming, it's everywhere now, and in fact, Beef and Lamb and MPI are funding large amounts of money into looking into it, and our feelings are we're pretty well doing regenerative, what is termed as regenerative agriculture, clover-based, in situ grazing, rotational grazing, all of those things. We also now, because whether you have to or because you want to, we're fencing off streams and creating wetlands and things like that. So, these are all good goals. So many of the goals and aspirations of the new regenerative farming is pretty much what we're doing. It's a system that's been developed overseas on impoverished soils that have been overcropped or overgrazed. And on our hill country, sheep and beef in particular, we've been doing a lot of these things that they are now discovering, almost modelling the New Zealand farming methods to try and build up their organic matter and their soil life. And now it's come here, and it's almost like we haven't been doing it correctly and we need to do more. I guess the big change is the fact, is not using fertilisers, what they would term artificial fertilisers. Superphosphate seems to be a no-no. But to put compost at scale or seaweed and fish fertiliser, it's just not practical, because you need to replace your nutrients. If you're going to farm at all sustainably and take a harvest off and the natural leaching of those nutrients that happens, you've got to replace them. Otherwise, it's not sustainable. And I'm sure regenerative farmers want to be sustainable. And so we probably differ mostly on the use of superphosphate in particular. But if you go to Ballantrae, which is just out of Woodville, they have trials that have been running for 50 or 60 years. It's one of the longest running trials where they have a zero fertiliser plot, they have a low fertiliser plot and a high fertiliser plot. Really interesting trial. It's going to be lost actually because the new road that's going to replace the gorge is going to go right through the middle of it, through the Tararuas. But that's got a lot of learnings from that 50 or 60 year bit of science. And one of them is, you would think, people are down on superphosphate and how it's harmful to soil life and earthworms. Well, that's not true. The science shows in that long-running trial that the plot that has no superphosphate at all has the least earthworms by miles. And the plot with a high superphosphate has the most because you're growing a lot more dry matter, a lot more grass, and it's returning back to the soil and it's sustaining the soil life and the earthworms are using it.
That is interesting, and I'd really like to understand what the grazing management on those trials was as well, to have that fair comparison. Would you be able to explain what your understanding of rotational and in situ grazing is, Steve?
Okay, well, the grazing management on those bale and tray trials are much as what is happening on my farm and everyone else's in terms of rotational grazing. I aim to grow, I don't grow 10 tonnes, but if we use 10 tonnes as a figure, because the maths are easier, I'd probably grow around about 8 tonnes in this environment. My Olsen P levels are good. They're 30, so I've got them at the biological and the economic optimum, and that's through lifting them with superphosphate. But if you're growing about 10 tonnes of dry matter and you're utilising 80% of that, so 8 tonnes gets used to feed and grow stock, the other 2 tonnes returns to the soil as effectively as compost. So it's returned back to the soil and creates and sustains that soil life like earthworms and other microorganisms. If you're only growing 5 tonnes, if you're not putting on fertiliser, so you're growing half as much dry matter, you're only going to be returning at 80%, you'll be returning 1 tonne back to the soil, so half the return. So it's not as simplistic as the proponents of regenerative agriculture make out, that using fertiliser is a bad thing and you need to use alternative fertilisers. We all agree that you need to replace the nutrients lost. So to answer your question, I'm using rotational grazing. Basically the dairy model. We've got 360 hectares, 320 effective, and an average size of 2.5 hectare paddocks. So a lot of rotational grazing going on here, which is what the advocates of regenerative agriculture are promoting. Yeah,
at the same time though, Steve, you would acknowledge that not everybody's level of cover crop that they have and when they leave to move on is equal, in the fact that there is a lot of, let's say, tennis court grazing management in certain farming practices around New Zealand as well. And so therefore it's very hard when production is the one thing that is the most incentivised over making sure that there is sustainable soil health. How do you believe that there is certain practices that we are doing in New Zealand, not saying yourself and not saying certain sheep and beef farmers or certain dairy farmers, but that we do need to improve on?
Well, tennis court grazing, if someone's set stocking and hard grazing, they're not going to get the production and performance. And there are plenty of people like that, and they're comfortable and happy with that way of farming. But all of the things that we're talking about now, the bale and tray trials, fertiliser usage, rotational grazing, none of this is new. This is stuff that was done 60, 70, 80 years ago at Okuora, bale and tray, all around the country. So that's the frustrating thing, is the science doesn't back many of the claims that the regenerative farming people are pushing. So it comes down to, are we going to believe and trust in science, or are we not going to?
Science is an evolving thing as well, and very much practices such as rotations of pasture and crop species could be said that one is to rotate, but to what length are we rotating over a period of time? And then in Hawke's Bay, it varies very much differently to Canterbury and Southland, and recommendations based on the microclimate and geological makeup of our different regions is also something to take on board too, Steve. So how do we have a balanced discussion around something that potentially could be a massive opportunity for New Zealand?
Well, that discussion needs to be around the sort of discussion you and I are having is that what we're doing is already pretty good. My organic matter in my soils is at peak carbon, peak capacity. I can't create any more because I've done, as the people before me have done, replacing the nutrients and grazing it with ruminants whose dug and urine has gone back into the soil and helping to build up that soil matter. So we're already doing many of these things. And I guess the very term itself, regenerative, is probably what pisses the likes of me off, because it implies that those of us who don't call ourselves regenerative farmers aren't doing the right things by the world.
Why would you not call yourself regenerative, Steve, if that is exactly what you're doing, regenerating? Is it because you believe that to regenerate is to admit that you have a problem?
Well, I mean, I think the column that you're referring to, I said that at the end as well. I am pretty well doing what regenerative farmers want us to do, other than using superphosphate. Maybe I should just embrace the term and call myself regenerative farming and just go with the flow, because it certainly is the flavour of the month. I mean, I'm an old fella, Sarah. I've seen fashions come and go. Organics, biodynamics. There's this. It comes back to the nutrients. You have to replace the nutrients in a way that is financially, sensible. And the system that we have is, to put the superphosphate onto the soils to grow clover, which will then fix all of that free nitrogen in the air, some 80% of the atmosphere, and take it down into the soil with those amazing rhizobia, and then that nitrogen becomes available to the grasses as well as the clover. I mean, it's a fantastic system, and other countries look at it. We're fortunate. We're a temperate nation. We live in this big sea of relatively warm water that allows us to grow clover for 9 or 10 months of the year. So others are looking at us who use a lot of artificial nitrogen and are trying to copy what we're doing, and hence regenerative farming. It's similar to what we do anyway.
Steve, what's your opinion? I mean, I want to go beyond your farm gate, and I want to talk. You are a rural commentator for many, many decades as well, and it's not. There is a lot of various different farming management practices, and we have seen a rise in the use of winter cropping, winter grazing, and soil structure being very different than it has been, back in the day as well. Where do you think that has a future in soil erosion and soil structure and health?
Yeah, I mean, as you said earlier in the conversation, science is evolving, understanding and knowledge is evolving all the time. And we've learned a lot about cropping in terms of using ruminants to harvest winter crops, which is our way of getting them through the winter. And we've learned that, and many times we've been doing it badly in terms of nutrients being able to get into waterways and pugging damage of the soils. I mean, most of us who do rotational graze and winter crop do everything we can to avoid pugging, because we do know that we've known that for a long time. It's bad for the soil. If you get some pugging, even on pasture, when I was intensively strip grazing, that area would grow thistles and would be poor in grass, but it was very contained, and they would move on when the rainstorm had gone and it would be fine. So we know it's bad, and we're now finding out much more about poor grazing practices, winter practices on crops. It's a particular problem in places like Canterbury and in Southland. But we're all learning, and for better or for worse, well, it's for better, we're having to change how we do it and not have stock anywhere near the waterways and graze it appropriately, and just move your wires around in a different fashion to minimise the losses of sediments and nitrogen and shit going into the waterways.
How do you believe we pull the bottom up in New Zealand?
Yeah, that's always important. That's the case in any industry or any human activity. In farming, we have people who let the side down. That's just part of being human. Not everyone is good at what they do or is keen on improving. So they will get picked up by regulation, because we now have freshwater laws coming at us, and regional councils are becoming much more diligent in their policing of these matters. So the miscreants, it'll be the stick. I mean, they will, as is happening now, they will be fined, and I guess, shamed in the newspapers.
And you referred to in your opinion article that there is no sensibility to Beef and Lamb New Zealand, an organisation that your levies go to, as well as a lot of sheep and beef farmers in New Zealand, to be doing a study into a practice which they believe will only have benefits in the likes of the marketing campaigns of Taste Pure Nature. Why do you hold those views that an organisation should not be getting involved in this debate or discussion?
And you talked about the marketing things, of Taste New Zealand. I mean, that's where this thing is a little clouded because, is it a marketing program, regenerative agriculture, or is it a sensible program that's going to make our soils and our lives and our waterways and our farms more profitable and productive? I mean, there's two different things there. But yes, marketing. I mean, the marketing push probably should be, look, we really are, as a whole, already doing many of these things. What annoyed me about Beef and Lamb, they were talking about sending people overseas. Well, they're probably not sending them overseas at the moment because of the pandemic. But they wanted to go all around the world so they could understand the similarities and differences to New Zealand farming practices from regenerative agriculture. Well, honestly, they know they don't need to do that, go all around the world and spend a large amount of money to find that out, because we already know that. And I imagine that you'll be talking to scientists on this matter as well as part of this podcast. But we know the answers to that. Why would they squander bloody levy funds to find out something that they can find here? Just by picking up a phone and ringing, a scientist, someone like Doug Edmonds.
And we will have Professor John Hickford on later on in the show as well, who is the president of the New Zealand Agricultural and Horticultural Science Institute, who also will be able to provide some background to the sound science that Steve has been referring to there. Steve, thank you very much for your time and your thoughts on this. I will continue to follow your opinion pieces in Farmers Weekly from the Ridge. I really appreciate your time. Thank you, Steve. Steve Wyn-Harris there, opinion writer, rural commentator, a Hawke's Bay sheep and beef farmer, on his thoughts. And it is a continuing discussion we will have over the next hour, talking about science. We had some viewer comments. One was from Matthew. Science is only as good as the hypotheses and interpretation of the results. And Catherine wrote, let's not forget that those who are funding science have a stake in the results. And a quote from William has said, study books and observe nature, and if the two don't agree, throw away the books. We're going to continue the discussion on how to embrace the term regenerative, as Steve pointed out there, if we are already practicing it, or, however, there is work to do. Philanthropist, marketing expert, and, of course, regenerative farmer from Lake Hawea Station, Geoff Ross, will share his views up next here on Sarah's Country.
This is Sarah's Country. Catch the latest on the matters that matter most wherever you are. Listen to Sarah's Country on Spotify, iHeartRadio, Apple or Google Podcasts. Try asking Alexa or Siri. Play Sarah's Country on podcast.
One of the first things you learn when you live out here
is where to shop for the things you need to live out here.
like electric fencing,
or horse feed,
or bee suits,
children,
chook food.
Do you want a couple of these?
Or something stylish to wear. Not everyone's got stuff like this.
But at Farmlands we do, and then some.
So if you need anything to help you farm,
Grow, milk, drench.
Rhea, come on in.
Because we're out here too.
Well, as I stated in the introduction, I did watch Kiss the Ground, a documentary on Netflix. And when it comes down to it, where, as Steve Wyn-Harris pointed out, here in New Zealand, many believe that we may already be what is termed regenerative, and we need to capture this for our consumer perception. However, whether we like it or not, documentaries such as Kiss the Ground do determine the direction and perception around the demands of our consumers. Overseas, the likes of Walmart are stating that they are moving into sourcing from practices such as regenerative agriculture. And I really enjoyed some more comments coming in from Facebook. Michael said, what is the consequences of consumers who are now more aware and probably don't believe the old? We have always been regenerative, quote. Surely if everyone was working well in sync with nature processes, we would have cleaner water, healthier pastures, people and animals that do not need constant over-the-shelf remedies. And Dan commented saying, if it's what we are doing already, then why would we have so much effect from droughts, floods, dirty rivers, and the need for vets? So some interesting comments there when it comes to the discussion of this Opinion Maker show, which is, are we already regenerative? And is this a direction for us to clip the ticket for the direction our consumers are demanding? Well, someone I thought would be extremely valuable to the discussion is the former CEO of 42 Below Vodka. He is involved in philanthropy group Pure Advantage. He has been involved with Saatchi and Saatchi in some of our biggest marketing campaigns. And proudly, the title I know he enjoys the most is he is a farmer from Lake Hawea Station. Geoff Ross joins us now. Geoff, thank you so much for taking the time to have this discussion of one I know that you are extremely passionate about. Now, buying Lake Hawea Station wasn't your first entry into farming. Could you give, to start with, some context in your passion and involvement for the primary sector in New Zealand?
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, Sarah. So I grew up on a farm, like many New Zealanders, a dairy and deer farm in the northern Waikato. Went to Lincoln to become a farmer, did a BCom Ag, and loved it with the intention of going farming, but did get seduced by the advertising and marketing world for several decades, actually. So coming to Lake Hawea Station was a welcome return to farming, which was always the plan.
And when you purchased the property, what were some of the guiding principles that yourself and your wife Justine ensured were going to be the fundamental direction of the station?
Yeah, there were several. So the first one was the big macro trend in the world right now, which I think will get us into regenerative, and the opportunity for New Zealand is that consumers worldwide, the macro trend is they want to connect directly to the farm, the source. And so we saw a business opportunity first and foremost with being a farm, a provider of food and fibre that we think we can directly connect to other buyers with worldwide. So we saw an opportunity there. That was one guiding principle. The other one was environment. Look, we've always been passionate believers in the need to protect and enhance the environment. We're believers in that farming and environmental stewardship can go hand in hand. So we wanted to put that to effect and be a fantastic environmental custodian, and also an effective producer of food and fibre as well.
Yeah. So we've had Wyn-Harris, a Central Hawke's Bay farmer, on just before you, Geoff, who claims, like many in New Zealand, both from the scientific world as well as farming circles, that our practices in New Zealand are already regenerative. I'd like your thoughts.
I think they are, in the most part, regenerative. So the term regenerative, as I understand it, comes from the US, where a lot of pastures don't regenerate from year to year. They're one-offs, I guess. They're annuals. In fact, they're deliberately, in some cases, sprayed out, and then the pasture is retilled, or resprayed, retilled, and they go again. Whereas in New Zealand, most of our pastures do typically regenerate from year to year. The difference, however, or the piece that I think New Zealand needs to now go to is diversity. So we largely do have pastures that regenerate, but those pastures in many cases are mono or duocultures. So diversity is the piece I think we now need to start adding. So the more life above the ground means the more life below the ground, and healthy soils mean healthier animals. And the other cool thing about healthier soils is they sequester more carbon. And I think therein lies the opportunity, or one of many opportunities, in New Zealand kind of grasping this regenerative opportunity that the world is talking about, and actually being leaders in it. Because I think we've got some natural start points. We're in many ways we're in pole position really to lead it and be and use it as a competitive market advantage.
I want to get onto that competitive market advantage, something that you know a lot about in terms of premium brands. But Geoff, when it comes to the right farm management practice for the right microclimate and geological makeup, Lake Hawea Station with merinos differs from Taranaki dairy country, as does cropping on the Canterbury Plains, and therefore the conversation really differs and is something that will be a way, how do you capture a value whereby there's so much complexity around defining something as is regenerative?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. I don't think there's going to be a neat, succinct definition for regenerative agriculture as much as we'd love one. As you know, I come from a brand world. I think there's been thousands of people trying to put a neat, succinct definition to the word brand for years, and no one's ever achieved it. And I think that might be true in regenerative. However, there's some principles. And I think it's going to change from farm to farm. I think on our own farm, we're north of 100 hectares now in regenerative pastures, and and we're still learning, of course, but we've noticed there's differences required from one paddock to another, from one end of the farm to another. So the differences across the country are going to be huge. What's going to work for one farmer is going to be incredibly different to another. Pasture selection is going to be very different. We've all got different farming systems, different climates, different soils. So of course it's going to change. However, there's some principles that can guide us, of course, and a key one for me is diversity.
So therefore, if we can't define it, how do we incentivize and to embrace the change of the consumer's demands on us when we are predominantly incentivized on production currently?
Look, I think if we have that conversation, I guess back to our first point, the world is able now to look into our backyards quite literally. So our buyers can see what our farms are doing. And if we tell that story with some honesty, we're able to demonstrate our practices and therefore get a premium to it. So I think if you look in the fibre sector, and New Zealand Merino, I think are leaders here, they're speaking to their clients. Their clients, like many the world over, are saying we want regeneratively grown products. And they are putting in place some guidelines for their growers, their farmers, to produce what they would term, and what we as growers would term, regenerative grown fibre. So if we create a definition and the world believes that definition, and it can be different from farm to farm, however, as long as we tell that story and we're open with it, that is going to be acceptable, and I think that'll be in fact embraced by global buyers and global consumers.
When you have a small supply pool in the likes of New Zealand Merino or the sourcing of our value-added products, what would be your advice to larger processors and suppliers in capturing value in markets that don't yet appreciate these fundamentals of how we farm and grow, and the likes of our largest trading partner, that is China, and our largest trading commodity, which is dairy products?
I would say make a start. Like in any business, just start small, start somewhere. There will be a niche. Let's talk about dairy. Look, typically, and I'm generalizing here, China are typically late movers in global popular culture, in global popular trends. So look, I think they will come down the track. If you look at the US, however, they're typically, not just in agriculture, but in all sorts of popular trends, whether it be music, movies, fashion, they're typically an early mover, and that will be the same in our food and fibre. So the demand in the US for regen is much higher. So let's start there. Let's create, appropriate brands and products for that market, and in time that will grow to other global markets.
And Geoff, there is a goal of the station, I know from reading my notes here, that to move from a carbon neutral position, which you are currently marketing fibre on, to a carbon negative times 10. What's been your biggest learning in terms of where we are for the tools that our farmers need to actually define where they currently are and currently can move to, and the work you think needs to be done?
Yeah, and I think as Tim Brown from Allbirds said, carbon is actually the North Star. That's the big goal, right, for the world and every sector, particularly agriculture. Regenerative farming systems are a great way, a way the world understands of getting there. But there are other ways, of course. So you're right. So our own journey on carbon, which is the most important for us, is that, one, know our number. So we've looked at our vegetation, our sequestration, obviously our emissions, all our methane emissions, and you're right. So we're around 2.5 carbon negative, if you use that term. So we sequester 2.5 times more than we emit, and that is easily calculated by looking at our vegetation. We've had a number of experts in this field looking at our trees and regenerating bush to see what we're sequestering versus obviously what we're emitting, which can easily be calculated through Overseer. To get us to 10, the big hairy goal, that's a big step on. That's going to need some form of reduction in methane. We don't think we need to reduce stock numbers to get there. In fact, we're actually trying to increase stock numbers and increase production at the moment. We think we can do that through two means. One is regenerative agriculture looks as though it can reduce methane emissions, because basically diversity of diet, if you think, look, I know if I only ate lettuce all year and maybe the odd carrot, I know how my stomach would behave and what my methane emissions would be, versus if I had full access to the salad bar and I could self-select, I think my methane emissions would be a hell of a lot less. And it's true in stock. So by calculating that and measuring that, and there's a lot of science going on, Lincoln's looking at this as well, by calculating the methane reductions by better grazing, by better diversity, that's going to make a huge step for us. And then there's work in seaweed, for instance. Asparagopsis is a seaweed which can reduce methane by 90%. There's trials going on in Merino Station in Australia right now using that as a tonic. So if we can increase our sequestration but reduce our emissions through regen pastures and seaweed tonics or things like that, some of the new science that's coming, I think we can get to 10. That's the big goal.
And just closing there, Geoff, when it comes to the profitability of our farms, I understand from the work that you're involved with, Pure Advantage, the goal is to work out the relationship between the environment and the economy. What does utopia look like to ensure that we're winning on both scales?
Yeah, well, I guess in any business, what your goal is to ideally produce more, but from less, and then get a premium for what you produce. And so that's why we see regenerative as a tool. Look, we're early in the journey. Others have been ahead of us, but we look to producing more dry matter, more usable dry matter, particularly so for merinos, which are browsers, not grazers. So we think they're going to really respond to that diversity. And for less, so we think the inputs are going to be less because of regenerative pastures. We certainly don't need to till as much. We think we can do it with less fertilizer and potentially less irrigation. So that is the exciting thing from a farming point of view, is that we can increase production, but we can increase biodiversity as well. And then we can also sequester more carbon through more active pastures are going to be turning all that organic matter into liquid carbon.
Thank you so much for taking the time to join us, Geoff Ross, farming with his wife Justine at Lake Hawea Station, and of course from an extensive marketing background, building some fantastic New Zealand brands such as the likes of 42 Below, and is sitting on the board with Moa Beer and of course Okuora Candles. So therefore we are going to continue on hearing the thoughts there from both Steve Wyn-Harris, farming in Hawke's Bay, Geoff, farming in Central Otago, and now we're going to talk to industry leaders and then science academics around their thoughts, which can be able to capture and define the direction of where we are going, particularly from our primary sector council's goal and guardianship around the word te taiao. All that up next here on Sarah's Country.
This is Sarah's Country. Join the conversation. Have thoughts on an interview? Or have you got questions you want answered by a future guest? Let us know. Email sarah@sarahscountry.com.
The recipe for perfect beef and lamb. Take one small fresh country. Make sure it's nice and remote. Now, keep it at the ideal temperature all year round. Next, mix in the farmers. They go perfectly with the nature of this unique place. Add regular sprinkles of rain to really bring out the lush meadow grass. Then let your animals happily graze on this grass all day, every day. And there you have it, New Zealand, the perfect recipe for beef and lamb. Taste pure nature.
Well, so far we've heard from Hawke's Bay farmer Steve Wyn-Harris and Lake Hawea station owner Geoff Ross, and some diversity of thinking around the theme. Are we already regenerative farming in our systems here in New Zealand? Or, as one of our next guests on the panel has put it, is a craze from a US fad that we are already farming here and we just need to learn how to capture the value of. And we have on the panel today Maury, Leyland, Penno and Professor John Hickford from Lincoln University. Firstly, Maury, welcome. Thank you so much for coming into the studio. Thank you. And John as well there, coming in remotely. Let's just set the scene a little bit in terms of your background to bringing to the conversation today, as well as where we should be directing this discussion. Maury, could you please give us to today and what you're actively involved in from a governance perspective, but also physically on the ground on farm?
Yeah, sure. So I came from quite a long, originally engineering and then corporate background, the large part of that at Fonterra, so in food and farming, particularly the food part. And when I left Fonterra 5 years ago, I guess had a strong desire to be involved in food and farming going forward, but to help New Zealand, in our small way, because you can only make a personal contribution to New Zealand continuing to shoot to the future in terms of what we need to be doing better, getting to the right consumers, and really importantly, looking after our environment. So to that end, and we do think that we need to be farming a bit differently. So we've got right into farming. So we have a farming enterprise in North Canterbury, doing sheep and beef and moving that into horticulture at breakneck speed. So that is a lot of fun and challenge. And we're also looking at, we've invested in a number of food businesses, from businesses which exist, like Pure Food, which is producing high protein, nutritious food for older people who are struggling with their health, through to Leaft Foods, which is producing plant protein from green leafy crops. And the driver there was the world is making a shift towards plant protein. We don't think that's necessarily going to be at the expense of dairy and meat. There might be less, but let's make sure New Zealand is positioned at the really high end. But we really should play in the plant protein space. We can't really grow peas, soy in a competitive manner. And the way they're grown is not particularly fantastic anyway. What we do grow well is green leafy crops. So let's progress there. So we're making some fantastic progress with Leaft. And in all of those, there are some common themes about how we connect to the customer, what the customer's really asking for. how we put our farming practices to connect with that and really deliver on the promises that we're making to customers that they're wanting to hear. So that whole supply chain and how we farm is of absolutely critical importance to everything we do.
Thank you so much, Maury, and to you, John. The context of your involvement as both a professor long-term at Lincoln University, as well as, of course, a president of the New Zealand Agriculture and Horticultural Science Institute here in this country. John, can you just give us a bit of context around the years that you have been studying and progressing agricultural science for the benefit of both what our consumer demands, but also our farming environments as well?
Yeah, so I think what we're seeing, and Maury used some great words there, that, we've got to add value, we've got to be able to show off that our value proposition, our supply chain is of the best quality. And we have a very good system, and, we should be proud of what we've done. And a lot of what we've achieved has been on the back of agricultural science, and especially pastoralism, focusing on how to most efficiently use pastoral lands to produce high quality protein. And we're very good at that. So then when we see regenerative agriculture come along, and I use the word ballyhoo, which I think is a great word, and sort of illustrates the point that there's a lot of noise being made about this. We could easily assume that there's a flaw in our fundamental production systems, or that they're majorly flawed, or that we're having a huge negative impact on the environment. Look, everything we do on the land has an impact on the environment. What we need to do is minimise that. So in that context, I went to a collection of agricultural scientists, some of whom are members of the Institute of Ag and Horticulture, some for whom aren't, and we put together sort of a picture, a profile from the soil up of how we saw regenerative agriculture fitting into things, and what we saw as the strengths and weaknesses, and where we thought we needed to sort of get better understanding. So for me personally, I'm a geneticist, so I don't have a lot of flesh in the game in terms of how we run our production systems, but we had soil scientists and plant scientists and people who understand how we use those resources to produce animal protein, and I wanted their perspective. So that's what we put out just prior to Christmas, was a quite detailed report on how we see regenerative agriculture and what we think needs to be upheld. And of course, when you talk about what needs to be upheld, it has to be scientific. And so one of the issues that I think was most pressing was that we were seeing a lot of claims being made about what regenerative agriculture might do, but there was no substance to them. There's no underlying body of evidence or history of repeated testing to show that these claims actually were valid or not. And that's okay, but we like to see substance in arguments. I'd hate to think that we were sitting here in 4 or 5 years' time and going, actually, that was a really big mistake. This is not to say that what we're doing at the moment is perfect, and it's interesting to hear Maury say that. I think there's plenty of room for improvement in what we do, and there always has been in New Zealand farming.
And I do want to talk to you about that soon, John, around the areas of improvement that we can do here in New Zealand. And Maury, I want your thoughts on when there is no science present, does that not mean that holistically everything is super interconnected and we should be looking at it broader than just what's comes through in scientific reports?
Well, to some extent, I think we're talking at cross purposes, because I do think some of what's coming out of the United States and some of the reports that John's work quoted are kind of irrelevant here. We must look at New Zealand, a New Zealand context. We must pull back and look at how we can improve the environment that we're in. And I think science has an absolutely key role to play. And there are a wide spectrum of farmers working on a lot of things. So I don't want to focus on the corner of farmers who are maybe really picking up on some of those fringe practices, although those practices, they tend to lead to unexpected innovations over time. So I'm definitely not going to rubbish them. But most of the people, I think, in New Zealand working on regenerative farming are running commercial operations, want to have a happy and healthy environment. They want the soil, the water, the air to be clean and well, and they want to make sure they're making a contribution. Now, I think the role in science here there's a lot of scientific papers from overseas. I heard Alison Stewart talk about this the other day. There are, she said, literally millions that we could pick up and put into a New Zealand context around the benefits of diversity, the benefits of agroforestry in a New Zealand system. I mean, the list goes on and on. So I guess my challenge will be, how can the New Zealand science system pick up and run at full speed to work alongside these farmers, say, here's some research that we know exists, let's see how it sits in a New Zealand context, or I'm curious about these observations that you're making, let's consider what the scientific question is, dive deep into that and build up the case. Our business is not interested in doing anything that's not scientifically backed up, but sometimes when, it's the same in complex health issues, when you haven't got the science telling you what the recipe, what the formula is, sometimes you try things and then you hope that the scientists will run forward. So I guess that would be my challenge. And I think also, we need more young soil scientists. We need more people moving into this field. Youth today are very interested in food and farming production and how it's done. They need to know they're working on future solutions, not working on past solutions. So let's ask some new questions and answer them.
Yeah, John, what's your thoughts on the direction of science based on what Maury just said there?
Well, it's actually quite interesting because I think one of the things we've witnessed over the last 20 years in New Zealand is ever reducing funding going into agricultural science in New Zealand. And you wouldn't have to go far to find a few hundred agricultural and horticultural scientists that would say that. We've drawn away from what we did. So we are currently running production systems in New Zealand, in many cases based on science that was done in the 60s and 70s. Now the emphasis seems to be going more and more on innovation and short-term thinking and politically appropriate thinking as opposed to looking at deeper issues. And that too has worried me for many years, that there are basic understandings about what we can do with our land and how we should manage our land, how we ensure that we don't have negative impacts on waterways, on biodiversity, that aren't being done because we're not putting the money into it. And I know that's always the catch cry of scientists, but the money's been going into things at times that have yielded very little benefit to our land management practices, to our production systems, to the value of the product we produce off those systems. Our big companies, Maury was saying she worked for Fonterra. Fonterra has been good in that space. It's actually done a phenomenal amount to improve our understanding of nutrient flows, these sorts of things, working with Dairy New Zealand. But the amount of money going into those things has actually reduced markedly.
Maury, what is the role there of the supplier, the processor, to invest in R&D and the corporate responsibility of that in its flow and effect?
Well, there's a role of the supplier and the processor. That certainly is true. But I could not agree with John more in terms of the role of our national focus, having a national strategy which goes towards the future, funding our research institutions and universities to go in those ways. I think everything John just said, I largely am in strong agreement. Food and production is very important to New Zealand and will remain so going forward. We need to make it a national priority. A lot of our practices, like John said, are based in the 60s. I think we can do a lot better. We have great scientists. We have great knowledge. Farmers, clearly there's this big group of farmers who have got a real performance mindset, continuous learning, adaptive. Let's harness the strengths of all the things we're talking about and take that forward. I don't think we need to argue about regenerative farming in America is bad or not us. I just don't, let's not go there. In our country, in our context, we've got issues environmentally with our fresh water. Even if we say our soils have relatively good amounts of carbon, we have big erosion problems. We don't understand the carbon side well. We need more science and data. So let's pull together.
And I do want to talk to you about that, John, because I discussed that with Steve around our winter grazing practices in New Zealand, and therefore there has been a lot of science coming out of universities and Crown Research Institutes that has led to heavy winter grazing on fodder crops and have had a flow-on effect. You would not disagree with the fact that we do have issues in the room that we do have to address. And if there is a management system, such as some of the principles of regenerative agriculture, that can assist us in a way that's going to help with our freshwater quality and our climate challenges, that could only be a positive.
Yeah, look, and I mean, you take your winter grazing, there's work to do there, and we really need to focus on that. And you and I have discussed that previously, the need to have better practices, and they're not good systems. We can improve upon those. I mean, perhaps showing where politics has got in the way, we can go back in recent history to 1 billion trees initiatives. We know that monoculture plantation forestry can have a huge negative impact on the environment, but it was pushed strongly as a means of making money and offsetting carbon, but it's not a particularly elaborate or smart means. And when I saw high quality farmland going under Pinus radiata plantation forestry, I mean, you just despair. In that context, some of us have said if it had been 1 billion fence posts rather than 1 billion trees, then we might have been able to fence off some of that land that is of limited value to production, a lot of the land that has a unique biodiversity values, and of course we could fence off waterways. Farmers often don't have the capital or the cash on hand to be able to build fences, but fences and fencing could have had a huge impact and positive impact on how we manage our land resources far more responsibly, and it would have had a much better impact than 1 billion pine trees or 1 billion monoculture plantation trees. So, fencing, better land management, appropriate use of land, these are the things that we've really got to think about now in New Zealand. Is what we're doing on this land, is the system we're using appropriate for the land that's there, and can we do it better? And if we're going to spend money, that's where I'd like it spent.
I think there is a big discussion to have about trees and how we use trees and how farming and trees work together. I think that's a huge discussion. But coming back to what we're doing on farm and things like winter crops and fodder beet, we're growing fodder beet and we're still growing it as a monoculture, although we're going to try some different things this winter as well. But so we're trying direct drilling it instead of precision drilling it. We've got pastures alongside it, which are mixed forage, high protein, high fibre. We're putting an extra gate so that the stock can move in and out. But this is not based on the science or a beef and lamb report. This is the standard recipe would tell us to not necessarily focus on some of the things we're doing. So could the science please catch up? And we might be doing it all wrong, but give us some suggestions and how we do these things differently and better. Rather than leaving us in the space of winter crops are bad, but where do we go from here?
That's a valid point, John, because if we were to farm based on when regulation and science caught up, we wouldn't lead the world in some of the principles we do today.
Yeah, I mean, fodder beet has taken off as an example as a wintering crop because it is so good. It's such a phenomenally great source of nutrition. However, it isn't necessarily the best one in terms of the impact on the environment. We know that. So it's a matter of adapting our practices around the use of fodder beet to minimise the environmental impact. And some of the things that Maury suggested are the sorts of things we should be investigating. But again, they can only be investigated if we put the money into investigating them. So if we take fodder beet, there's obviously been seed companies that are selling the seed that farmers have been using. There have been systems developed around extensive planting of fodder beet, and that's well and good. And farmers make money out of its use. There's little doubting that. But it is having an impact, and maybe we do need to look at that, and money needs to come from the agencies that might fund that science, so Ministry of Primary Industries, the likes, and they need to start to fund and look at alternatives or better ways of managing the use of those sorts of crops. It's not necessarily a new thing. I mean, we know that Southland farmers have wintered on Swedes for years, and then along comes fodder beet, and hey, it's better than Swedes, and some people dispute that one, but it's about the management systems, and it's those systems and the advice around those systems that has been really wanting for money now in New Zealand for 25, 30 years. And stress the advice around the use of the systems. I mean, we got rid of some of the advisorial services that the government used to pay, but seen as a subsidy to farming. They went, but they also led to better practice on the land. And some people would argue we need those systems back, where we give sound advice to farmers on how to better use the systems they've got and minimise their impact. So it costs money, unfortunately, and using fodder beet makes money for farmers, and that's the challenge. Yeah.
Can I just wind back to your original question? Because John's right, we need more funding in these spaces, but the farmers who are calling themselves regenerative are trying these things. So how is that bad, and why is there such a disconnect? Because I think we all agree new things need to be tried here, and to have a look forward, how might I do things differently? How might I think about this? How can I gather views of those around, whether other farmers, because other farmers are a ready source, or scientists, but as we've just discussed, there's no science to help here. How is this bad? I mean, the farmers are going forward, trying new things with a performance mindset and an improvement mindset. This, to me, is hard to say is a bad idea for our country.
John?
Yeah, but you don't need to label it regenerative. So, I mean, if you go down the pathway again...
Can I just ask, why is the term so threatening to the science community?
I don't think the term is threatening, but implicit in regenerative is it insinuates immediately that everything that isn't regenerative is in some way degenerative, or it undermines the value of what we currently do, or it suggests that what we're currently doing isn't already doing it. So, you've talked to Geoff Ross already this morning. You've looked at some of the things he's doing at Lake Hawea Station. Fantastic stuff. And, of course, Geoff sells that really well. But he's actually not doing anything on the land there that isn't being done everywhere else, really. The practices he's using are great things. I wouldn't knock him on that. But you don't have to put a label on it. You can just say, actually, it's good farming is what we do in New Zealand. That stated, there are things we do that are negative and that we need to start to look at and say, well, can we do this better? So if you take the fodder beet example, like Lincoln University's trumpet on this one, we were looking at cut and carry methods for the use of fodder beet, where you don't have to have winter grazing systems. You can have systems where the feed's taken to the cows. You can go down that pathway a lot and then have housed cows. But is that where we want to go in our production system? So we are doing that research. There are alternative ways of thinking of how we use something that's as good as fodder beet. But again, that requires money, and it requires people that can do that research. And that research was being done at Ashley Dean Farm.
I think we need to get over ourselves of being hung up on a term. We know we have, I love New Zealand, I love the way we farm, there's a whole lot of good, but do we think that we're the best that we can be? Do you think Peter Burling wakes up in the morning and thinks, I can sail pretty well, so don't tell me I can sail any better? Regenerative is a term customers want, the big food companies around the world, they want it, restaurants want it. Let's show them what we can do. Let's demonstrate how we are regenerative. And yes, there's a lot of definition we need to do in terms of what promises would we make to customers about that, and how would we demonstrate it with the data and authenticity to show that that really is true. That is a big gap. But can we focus on that gap, not on the word? I don't think anybody here is saying New Zealand farming is rubbish.
But I think that illustrates one of the problems there, Maury, is that individual farmers don't get up in the morning and plan to farm badly, and many of them get up and do exactly what Geoff Ross and many others are doing. The problem is that then you have big corporates who, and I'm not knocking corporates here, who have to sell a product, not necessarily the farming system that produces the product. So be it the likes of Alliance Food or Fonterra or A2 Corporation, they're selling a product, but they cannot easily describe the production system of every farmer that's supplying to them. So this is where progress has to occur too, is that we need to get it to where our corporates, our big food sellers, our big exporters can describe in specific terms the farming systems that their suppliers actually are using. And that's going to take a lot of time, because until recently, Fonterra was obliged to take everyone's milk, as you know. Now they are setting good standards, and they're probably moving at a speed that's appropriate, given the constraints on the business that they have in terms of their existing client base. But I'm sure the people selling Fonterra products, or the brands, various brand marketers, would love to think that they could say, look, here's a model system that we all use. But there's a huge tail end of farmers supplying to those agencies who aren't necessarily where we need them to be. And so we can't have individual farmers selling their product. There are some that do, and I know that. I mean, we look at our fine wool industry. It's a classic example of individual farmers pushing their production systems and selling it at really high values into Italian markets, these sorts of things. But if you're a meat producer or a milk producer, you need to work through big corporates, you need to work through marketing departments, and it's really hard to get a good, clear message going to the market of the quality of our production system. I don't know who can drive that easily. I think government has to be involved at that level, and so people who are selling our product overseas or negotiating trade access have to be selling the merits of our production systems. But I think it's asking a lot of an individual farmer to do that. Geoff Ross, he's very good at it, we know that, but I'm not convinced that every farmer that I know has the capability of doing that easily.
Some great points. I think your original question about suppliers and processors, I think there's a real role for them to play in there. Coming from different background, I find the sheep and beef to be what's asked. It's the opportunity for market signals to get to farmers and for that communication flow to go backwards and forwards. And overall, I find it a little bit low on aspirations, as my experience coming in relatively new. So I think a lot of those companies are working on this really hard right now. I think that's the work that needs to go on. There needs to be clear messaging about what customers are looking for. Synlait and Fonterra's, they're working with customers who've got some pretty high expectations about farming systems. And we need to get that in place so we can say, our farming system that I am promising you with this product is X. And here is how I can show you that my suppliers are delivering to that. And I might not be able to accept every supplier. I can only accept the very top end or the ones which are working towards that. Yeah. The role for the tail end is not here. That's commodity products.
John, how do we have been led to believe that we talk to ourselves within this country that we can tell a very complex story efficiently overseas against a term that has coverage in Vogue, Netflix, and is demanded by the major retailers in the US and Europe? And how do we strongly believe that we're going to get that complex scientific system that you're describing away into something that's unique in New Zealand, that without using the term regenerative?
Simple answer is I don't know, Sarah, but that's true. I just simply don't know. It's a great term. It's a feel-good term. It has a value. It makes you feel positive about what you might be buying at the supermarket. That's why it works. That's why Vogue and others will pick it up. That's why politicians in this country are running around talking about it too. It sounds good. It sounds like we're doing things the right way. Getting the technical detail in there is devilishly hard. And so we need the big companies, we've mentioned some of them here, but even the smaller companies, to really sit down, look at the suppliers, the people that are giving them the product that they're then marketing offshore, and start to tell a detailed story about what the value proposition is in there, and the beliefs and the things they're trying to achieve in their production systems. Some people would ask that's going to require a little bit more sort of fractionation or diversification on what we do. Individual brands pushing, I see today talk of $5,000 a kilogram for Manuka honey, and that's a single brand. I won't give them the shout out on this one, but these are the sorts of things. But it's going to be a lot harder for your average sheep and beef farmer in North Canterbury, and I know a few, to take their product and put it into a specific international market, because they probably don't have the capital to go out there and create automate the supply chain, the processing chain, and they're running narrow margins as it is. We know the profitability of sheep and beef farming is not great, a lot of the time. So they just don't have the resources to do that. So it is going to take the likes of the big meat companies and some of the smaller, medium-sized meat companies to get out there and really sell the virtues of our system. We scientists can't. We can describe them in infinite detail. We can tell you how robust the systems are. We can tell you probably more about the weaknesses of the systems in terms of nutrient loss, these sorts of things, than we can the positives. But we do have to tell that story. And I just don't think the individual sheep and beef farmers, especially, or dairy farmers, have the resources to do that easily.
They don't. Let's diversify. Let's get them, the big meat companies to. They're building new programs all the time with premium margins. Let's aspire to join those programs. They've got higher standards than others. Let's have smaller companies doing different things. Let's diversify. We're growing hops. Hops are small in New Zealand. New Zealand hops are loved overseas. What are the smaller things that we can be doing? Geoff and Justine Ross are amazing marketers. We're not. Can we find a way to be that? No, but we won't be marketing our meat from the farm. We've got too many other priorities. It's not our talent set. We want to be working with the companies who are thinking about the market and providing the programs with a big premium. And if we do everything right, we can have that premium.
I want to talk about diversity building resilience. Maury, I know that from previous speeches that you've given, and John, the work that Pablo is doing at Lincoln University, pulling together the international conference Multiscapes in July. What does multi-land use both mean to both of you, and how can the principles of regenerative agriculture build resilience through diversity, regardless of the term that we're using?
Well, to me, one of the important themes of regenerative agriculture, the first theme is that you've got to see your farm as an ecosystem where you're working to improve the health of that whole ecosystem. And the second is thinking about diversity in all its forms. So looking at each piece of land, and John talked about this already, and thinking, for this piece of land, what is the best use, not just for me, production-wise, yield-wise, but is there an erosion issue? Might it be better in trees? Should I be fencing this area off? Is this the high production areas of my farm, and I'm going to focus here? If I'm not producing, a seed crop or a crop that needs to be a monoculture, is there an opportunity for me to have a diverse sward if it's a perennial pasture? Is there an opportunity for me to have companion crops? I think there's a lot of role for diversity within a farm and across farms. We're going a little bit further than that and saying let's introduce horticulture. That does require a whole lot more infrastructure and complexity, so that may not be for everybody, but we need to think about diversity, including in people, in its many forms. And I think there is science now to back up the benefits of diversity from a soil, plant, animal health perspective.
Look, great. I work with, you say, North Canterbury. I work with one North Canterbury farm that has 9 different income streams that protects them. So they're classical sheep and beef producers, but they're also working on elite wools, and they've got some ideas there about how they can produce higher value products off their strong wool at the moment, and there's some great work going on there. They take huge amounts of manuka honey off that property. They have carbon credits. They also produce timber. They have extensive plantation forestry. They also have hunting. They are working on preserving large tracts of native totara and cedar forest. 9 income streams protects them as a farming family.
That's pretty regenerative.
They're doing everything right. They know how to feed stock, and they don't need to do it by importing US systems. They're doing it on the back of sound science and their own approaches and understanding their land and using it more. And they're just putting in another 30 kilometres of fencing. That was their big move this year. That's not cheap investment in land, I might add.
So why can't we in New Zealand call that regenerative? Why can't that be what we sell to the world?
Well, we can call that regenerative. I have no trouble with that. It's certainly not organic if we want to go down that path. I have no trouble with that, but it's just a label. If it's a label that adds value to our products overseas, let's do it. I have no trouble with that. that. But if it's a label that condones practices that are holistic or feel good or unverified or out and out dodgy, no. So we probably need to define a New Zealand definition for regenerative.
And you gave me the best segue into my question for Maury, who's sitting on the Te Taiao Steering Committee and the Primary Sector Council Vision, whereby Damien O'Connor has said on Sarah's Country, look, stop calling it regen, then call it Te Taiao, and let's take ownership over our own production systems. Can you give us an update into where the work is progressing in that field at an industry top level?
Well, it's still pretty early days, but out of the primary sector working group last year, there was this concept of stepping back and thinking about what if we think about in partnership with a conventional and Māori view. So let's not focus on, what it's partnership, right? Let's all put our best brains together and think about this. If we think about nature being well, our farms being well, our people being well, and then we put the lens of our farming and our production systems and our profit systems through that, how might we come up with a New Zealand system, an Aotearoa system, which when we take that to the world, in whichever way we stamp it, verify it, authenticate it, show that it goes through the supply chain, how do we take that to the world? Now, I think there's an unknown question about whether you need to include the word regenerative in there so the consumer sort of recognises this thing they're very interested from watching various Netflix documentaries or not. But how do we put our own flavour with our unique strengths and the real benefits that we do have, but keep moving forward at high speed and build on the partnership strengths, knowledge and inherent capability that we already have.
John, just before I ask you both for a summary in terms of the direction in the next 12 months that you'd both like to see, would it not make sense that the science community embrace something whereby a lot of philanthropic, government and industry funds are going into defining and supporting a market position that will have a premium if you yourself said that science funding is being restricted and of course to progress what has been said is not based on sound science could be an opportunity for New Zealand's agricultural and horticultural scientists?
Well, the funding's there already. I mean, the money's being spent. If you're talking about creating a brand, something that we can sell to, and I think Te Taiao is a fantastic brand. I'm wholly supportive of that, provided the partnership there is there and there is tangata whenua involvement. That's a good brand to sell to. Let's be proud. Let's do it the New Zealand way. Science underpins that. I don't know if science necessarily has a voice in the creation of brand. Science ensures that when you create the brand and someone goes digging a little bit deeper into the brand, that the claims being made in the brand are actually justified. So science provides the foundation to sell our better systems. And I wholly agree. We've got to get out there and sell the quality of our production systems. They are really good. And we focus at times negatively on the dairy industry and we say, oh, look, high nutrient flows and these sorts of things. But it is the most carbon efficient dairy production system in the world. Research is showing this. We've got to be able to take that science, embody it in a brand and sell that and make money out of it. That's the challenge to us. If it's a unique brand like Te Taiao and not regenerative, but you can say, look, it's drawing on sound science and regenerative practices and other things that we value in New Zealand culturally, this is brilliant. We can do that. New Zealand is very good at charting its own path in this world. We should do it more often. So science creates the foundation. It doesn't create brand, it underpins the brand. And of course the beauty of science is that it isn't just about New Zealand science, it's about taking everything we know about the impact of plants on environment, the impact of pesticides, these sorts of things, everything. Science integrates all the information around the world that we know about agriculture and says, yeah, we're doing that in a New Zealand context and this is the impact of what we're doing in New Zealand. So it provides a very solid foundation so that someone out in the market can't say, hey, but you guys are just spinning a yarn here. It can actually provide the substance to what we're doing.
Okay, to close, I'd like to ask you both, where would you like the conversation to be steered and over the next 12 months around the term regenerative?
I think that John and I have talked about a lot of things which we're in very strong agreement with about where the country could go, some of the gaps, some of the things that we need to focus on. So I think we need to pull together on our future, get the funding lined up, find the fabulous scientists to line up and work on some common goals, because I think there's no need for this country to have a divisive debate. I think we can go forward with a high performance mindset, improving, adapting, and get to some great outcomes.
John?
Yeah, look, I would agree with that entirely. We've got to front foot it. We've got to be looking forward to how we create value in the market and how we ensure our long-term viability as a country. And yeah, we could look at it negatively. We know that, if we went too far down the holistic feel-good pathway, it could be our undoing. But we don't need to focus on that. We can focus on the positives and the things that are still challenges for us in terms of maximising biodiversity gains and improving water quality at the same time as we sell what we've already got as being a really good system. So, yeah, let's front foot it.
Fantastic. I really enjoyed that discussion. Thank you so much, Professor John Hickford from Lincoln University, involved in Ag and Hort Science Institute of New Zealand, and Maury Leyland Penno, former Senior Executive at Fonterra and, of course, co-founder of Leaft and Pure Foods, as well as farming in North Canterbury. I really appreciate you taking the time to join us around this discussion here on Ceres Country. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on this week's Opinion Maker. It's a topic that I've been wanting to get my teeth into, and it's something that certainly is an evolving conversation and doesn't end here and won't end here, because we collectively, what I found from the panel that we've just had, is that we are really all on the same page in terms of our values for our country that we want to stand by. It's just how we get there, and that's the most fun in terms of pulling to get apart a theme. And if you'd like to send in different issues that are happening within farming, food and fashion here in Aotearoa, New Zealand, please do email me, sarah@cerescountry.com. And of course, we will go through the pulpits that happen in Farmers Weekly. They're fantastic opinion pieces that you can get on farmersweekly.co.nz and have a good read in your rural newspaper, Farmers Weekly, because, we have an opportunity here on Ceres Country to dive in behind the headlines and get more in depth on these things, and there's so many issues to talk about. Next week on our Opinion Maker show, the recent pulpit by Federated Farmers Vice President Karen Williams was titled "On Farm Safety is a Choice." She talks about how many of us know of someone in our communities that has either been killed or suffered a life-changing injury due to an on-farm accident. Karen's going to be joining us to discuss her opinion piece, but also joined by a farmer who has changed many farming practices to create a safer environment after he had a close call. And the CEO for OnSide, a software that helps farmers manage the health and safety risk of people coming on and off farm. Ryan Higgs will talk about the check-in tool and how it's been able to help farmers be safer on farm. And tomorrow in our Changemakers show, as always, we have some inspiring innovations that come out of the industry week by week, whether it's how we're developing our farm assurance program for sheep and beef farmers here in New Zealand, how New Zealand is capitalising on the growth of Irish dairy boom and our companies getting involved there, as a charity fundraiser going towards a Southland hospital whereby they want to help insulate it with wool. Amy Blakely will join us to talk more about the overwhelming donations of wool for bales for Blair. And, of course, we uncover a 25-year-old cereal inventor, Logan Williams, who is based at New Zealand Merino, onto his fourth invention, known as Keravos, whereby he is saying he can underpin potential contract prices for strong wool of $5 a kilo. That's right, $5 a kilo for strong wool, when pairing it in a way that may be able to offer huge opportunities for the plastic industry. All that in Sarah's country tomorrow night on Changemaker. In the meantime, take care of yourself wherever you are in the world. It's been an absolute pleasure, and we will see you again. Ka kite anō.